I'm Reverend Patricia Adams Farmer, pastor of Millersburg Christian Church, and the title of my sermon today for Zoom is Holy Boldness, Matthew 25:14 through 30. If you could choose to visit a famous site anywhere in the world, like the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or the Colosseum in Rome, or the Giza pyramids, or any other place of your choice, which would you choose to see? Well, that's not an easy question to answer. There are so many fascinating places in the world to visit, and if you're an avid photographer, oh, you just can't see enough. British photographer Oliver Curtis has created a very successful career in films, television, and fashion photography. Now, his success revolves around capturing the perfect picture at the perfect moment. But he also has an odd side project. He likes to visit famous places and monuments around the world and then point his camera in the opposite direction of the famous monument. So he's taking a picture of the scenery around the world famous monuments like the Taj Mahal in India or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, but ignoring the monuments themselves. He has published these pictures in a book titled About Face. Well, we use the term about face to refer to someone who experiences a complete change in attitude or opinion or perspective. Think about Oliver Curtis's project. Here is a photographer in the presence of a well-known monument, but he wants to gain a new perspective, a perspective gained by focusing on its setting. And as a consequence, he sees things most people just don't see. How often do you stop and question why you notice the things that catch your attention? Generally, we follow the crowd. We fit in with our peers and with cultural expectations. We rarely question our priorities or our choices. What would it take for you to make a complete about face? A reversal of your choices, ideas, or priorities? What if you could see your life from God's perspective? That's a question I keep coming back to as I think about our lesson from Matthew's Gospel today, the parables of the talents. It's a parable about a man who went on a journey and entrusted his wealth to 3 servants. Now you'll see the word entrusted at least 3 times in these verses. He presented them with a big responsibility and a big opportunity. This man obviously had great faith in his servants. He saw potential in them, even if they couldn't see it themselves. The man must have seen something trustworthy in them too, because he gave them talents. Now, a talent is an astronomical sum of money, 6,000 denarii, roughly equivalent to 15 to 20 years of wages for the average worker in those days. It's like winning the lottery, except they were not given the money. They were entrusted the money as servants to make more money. Now the first 2 servants get down to business right away, trading the funds with resourceful daring and insight, usually doubling their money in each case. But a 3rd servant takes a timid, unimaginative approach, burying the money for fear of losing it. Why was he so afraid of losing it? Well, maybe because he simply couldn't see himself from the perspective of the man who gave him the talent. When he looked in the mirror, he saw only a man who had probably failed in the past and who had definitely failed in the past and would probably fail in the future. Perhaps he's afraid of the opportunity, that is, afraid of the responsibility. Lots of people are. Fear has become a way of life for this man. And so when the master returned, the servant dug up the wealth and gave it back to the master. No return on the investment, just one big lost opportunity. We may not be entrusted with talent in the form of money, which is what a talent was in those days. Most people in the world do not have a lot of money, and they certainly don't invest in things like the stock market. but we are all entrusted with talent of some kind. Not just money or musical talent or a gift for languages or woodworking, etc., but gifts that include our unique expressions of compassion and kindness, emotional intelligence, spiritual gifts of all kinds. All these things are God-given talents and sacred and a part of the spiritual wealth that has been given to us as seed money to invest in the world. We are divinely called to invest ourselves in some way in order to make the world a better place for all, to strengthen the community. And when we do, we not only see ourselves differently, but we see the world differently too. We see things we've never seen before. But it takes boldness, risk, the ability to see things from a new perspective, and not to be sabotaged by fear. Instead of fear and mistrust of God and others, this story from Matthew's Gospel tells us that Christ is looking for people with holy boldness. Well, what is holy boldness? Well, the willingness to look at ourselves differently, look at others differently, and to devote ourselves to something entirely outside of ourselves. And it may be a complete about face. It may be something that takes a great deal of risk. That's holy boldness. Now, there is a wonderful true story about a man named Robert Young. Now, this is not the movie star from Father Knows Best, if you are old enough to remember that TV show, but Robert Young, a successful businessman in Seattle. Well, one day, when on a business trip in New Mexico, he noticed a newspaper headline that said, "Elders freeze to death." The news article detailed the crushing poverty on local Native American reservations and the horrible living conditions of many elderly Native Americans. Robert couldn't explain why the news story grabbed at his heart, but it did. A few weeks later, when Robert learned of an Adopt a Grandparent program for Native American elders, he called the number and signed up. Robert was paired with a 78-year-old Native American woman in South Dakota named Catherine Redfeather. Now, Catherine Redfeather welcomed Robert into her family as her newest grandchild. In spite of her poverty, her letters to him were full of joy, proudly sharing news of her large family. When Robert asked Catherine Redfeather if there was anything he could send her, she asked only for a bottle of shampoo and some aspirin. Those two things. Robert couldn't imagine living in such poverty that shampoo and aspirin were luxury items. So he was determined to visit Catherine Redfeather and see her living conditions for himself. And so he did. Robert and his wife Anita were shocked by the poverty they saw on Catherine's reservation. No running water, children without shoes, abysmal living conditions, and inadequate shelter for the freezing temperatures in winter. And he was humbled by the joy and love of Catherine Redfeather and her family. When he returned home, Robert couldn't find satisfaction in his work. He worried all the time if his adopted grandmother was safe and warm and had all she needed. That summer, Robert, Anita, and a handful of friends traveled back to South Dakota to build a house for Catherine. As news of their project spread on the reservation, Catherine's family and friends showed up to help, and they had a big celebration when the home was completed. Now Robert could relax and get back to his ambitious and successful career. Except that he could not. He could not. God had put a new vision in Robert Young's heart, and he couldn't bury his talent in self-interested pursuits. After a lot of research and thought, Robert Young sold his half of his successful business. He and Anita moved to Bozeman, Montana, and started the Red Feather Development Group to provide affordable, secure housing to Native Americans. We are each entrusted with a gift, starting with the gift of life itself, which you cannot put a price on. On top of that, we are each gifted with some talent, not only money, but talent's worth much more. Like the compassion that led Robert and Anita to change their lives, to make an about face, to see the world from a different perspective. Investing our talents, however humble they may seem to us, change us. But not only that, it changes those around us. We become co-creators with a creative God who is always about the work of transforming the sufferings of the world. And we are God's hands and feet. It is the task we are called to do. But something happens to many of us along the way. That something is fear. Now, fear is not always a bad thing. The coronavirus has us all afraid, and that's a good thing to be afraid of. Because that's why God gave us fear, to protect us from such things as lions and tigers and deadly viruses. But we need to be aware of irrational fears, unfounded fears, fears including those caused by limited views of our worth and our potential. Once we risk our investment in the world, we are changed. We cannot see ourselves in the world the same way. We cannot be the same person. I often wonder if we use the gift of listening, the gift that most of us have, to listen to others. If we develop that talent, we might be able to calm the tense cultural divide. We may not change our own perspective, but we might just do an about face in our attitudes. Now that takes some holy boldness. And isn't it wonderful that God entrusts us? Trust goes both ways. We trust in God and God trusts in us, or is willing to take a risk on us, even knowing all our flaws and shortcomings. That should in itself change our perspective. God entrusts us with the work of investing ourselves in the world. And so, we are called to holy boldness. Holy boldness is the courage to try. We may not be successful in the world's sense of the word, but we are entrusted nevertheless to reach out with the gifts we have and invest in the heartbreaking world around us. When we do, we add to the amount of happiness in the world and enrich the very life of God. And that makes the risk worth everything. Amen.